All right, so here we are. This is lecture number 47. I love those numbers. I can't believe that we've lasted this long and we're still moving ahead. If we keep rolling at our pace, I'm guessing in approximately 2 months, we're going to finish the entire part one. So, which would be quite an achievement. We are up to chapter 67 in part one of the guide. And in the Pines English, it is on page 161. Uh, and before I start, just to review um, the well, actually, you know what? I don't have to review because this is starting something that's a little bit of a new subject. So the Rambam, as we remember, throughout the first part one, he often translates a word and gives us an understanding of how to understand the meaning of a word. And as we've learned until now, it's always a word that seems to signify a concept that is anthropomorphic of God, a concept which the Rambam is absolutely trying to get out of our heads and teach us is not relevant to God. So anytime you might read something in the Torah that's going to sound like God has certain any characteristics, or God has attributes, or God has human, like needs, desires, wants, powers, anything. The Rambam is often he'll take a phrase and he'll show us what that phrase really means in that context and what it really means. Now he doesn't do this for every single questionable concept like that in Tanakh, but he does it for a lot of them, so that we can understand how to do it ourselves. So today he's going to deal with something which is really from the Sheshet Yemei Bereshit, from the 6 days of creation. And there's several terms there which pop up a lot. One of them is that God spoke, right? God spoke, and thus something happened, right? Vayomer Hashem Yihar. God said, "Let there be light." So it makes a sound like God speaks, right? One might think God speaks, and then often it says Vayonach, right? And God rested. Most famous Vayonach Bayom Hashvi. God rested on the seventh day. It would seem to suggest that now the questions, Rambam doesn't specify the questions because it should be obvious what the questions are. What do you mean God rested? It sounds like, what do you mean? God, he was working really hard and got tired, so now he rested? Obviously that, that's what it sounds like. And obviously if you believe that, then it calls into question the entire premise of this entire book. So this chapter is now going to deal with those terms and what they really mean. Um, so um, so here goes. As to the term "say" of Vayomer, right? Uh, the is figuratively used, and figuratively in the Kapach's Hebrew translation is hush Allah, like lishol, is the word is borrowed. In other words, it has a use in one place and it's borrowed to mean something else in a different place. For the will, when it says Amar, Amira, it doesn't mean it's referring to someone's will or desire to do something or have something happen in a certain way. And how does this work? It is figurative use for the will in regard to everything that has been created in the 6 days of the beginning, in the Sheshet Yemei Bereshis, right? So that's why it says Vayomer, Vayomer, God said, and God said. Um, so what it means is not that he actually said anything, but it means that he wanted this to happen, right? Whatever God's will means, and Rambam discussed that at length already too. Similarly, and the term to rest, when God, like shivita, right, when God rests. So what does it mean? Is derivatively used, right, which is also, hush Allah, which is also, the same kind of thing with the reference to the Sabbath, as there was no creation on that day. It said that God rested, meaning that he stopped willing things to happen. He's going to go into this in a little more detail. So hold on, and let's hear the whole thought before we ask questions, because he's going to answer most of them in a second. It is accordingly said. That's why it says, and he rested vayonach bayom hashvi'i, and he rested on the seventh day. For refraining from speech is likewise called rest. When a person speaks and then stops speaking and holds back his speech, in various places in Tanakh we find that it's called rest. Thus it is said in Eov, right? It says, um, um, Vayishbetu sheloshet anashim ha'ela me'anot et Eov, right? Which is in Hebrew, it says those three men ceased to answer Job, Eov, right? There's three men, Vayishbetu, Shavat, from the language of Shabbat, right? They stopped talking. All it means is that they stopped talking. In other words, they were talking, and then they stopped. So what it means here, that Shavas, that God rested, it means, and similarly, we also find by the story of Naval and David in the Sefer of in the book of Samuel, in the book of Shmuel, it says, "Vayidabru el Naval kechol advarim ha'eleh b'shem David vayanuchu." They spoke to Naval. They communicated what David had said, vayanuchu, and they stopped speaking. The meaning of which, in my opinion, is then refrained from speech. It doesn't mean they rested because they were tired. It means they stopped doing what they were doing before, right? So it's just an absence. For in the preceding verses, there is no mention of their being tired in any way. It doesn't say that they were exhausted from talking or walking or working. So that even if they were tired, the term reposed would be quite extraneous to the story. It wouldn't make sense to call it rest. So Shavat doesn't necessarily mean to rest, but it also means to stop. So the scripture merely relates that they brought out that speech with its effort at graciousness and then were silent. In other words, they tried to give a good speech to convince Naval to, in that case, it was to allow David and his men to partake in the feast of his sheep on the day of his shearing of the sheep, that party then that was happening in the book of Samuel. So they gave a nice speech and then they stopped and waited for an answer. That is, they did not add, meaning what it means is they stopped. They did not add any other uttered notion to that speech or any act that would necessitate his reply to them, right? To be such as he gave. So for the purpose of the story, it was to give an account of Naval's blameworthiness and to make clear that it was extreme. In other words, that's all they said. And Naval answered them and he denied them their request and he acted like a jerk. So he's basically, Rambam is just saying that the point there is to say, that's all they said. They didn't say anything bad. They didn't say anything to insult him. They spoke nicely and they stopped. And then Naval nonetheless gave him a bad answer. So we need to, he's going to keep developing this thought now of what it means that God rested on the seventh day. So let's, I'm going to do this next paragraph is very interesting. So let me go through it. In this sense, it is likewise said, Vayonach bayom hashvi, and God rested. Now, there are other understandings as to what Vayonach means. And the Rambam here, and in several places, he talks about commentators, other Jewish commentators. And he usually, or very often at least, is referring to Rabbi Sadia Gaon. And this is another case where he's directly quoting from Rabbeinu Sadia Gaon. Why he doesn't name him by name here is unclear, because he didn't I think last week even he had a quote from Rabbeinu Sadia Gaon, but he's doing that again here. The sages and other commentators, and like I said, he's referring to the Rasag or Sadia Gaon, have made out the signification of the verb derives from that of rest. They did feel that the word Vayonach doesn't mean that he stopped, like I said. So I explained the verse my way, but they explained the verse differently. They understand that it means rest. So, but it's transitive, meaning they rested. It doesn't mean that God rested, but it means that God made to rest, caused something to rest. Now, how does that work? As the Chazal say I'm sorry, that's in Bereshis Rabbah in the Medrash, they say God Vayonach Olamo, God made his world rest, right? Vayonach, and he caused to rest on the seventh day. So it doesn't mean that God rested. So that's how they answer the question. What God did was, but what does that mean? Meaning that creation ceased on that day. The first 6 days, there was an active process of creation where all the rules and laws of nature and physics were being developed and being put into place. And then Shabbos was the day where all those laws were in place. The world was set to be as the world is. So if this were so, I'm skipping a few little things here about the first and third radicals. I'm not going to go into the too much of the grammar here, but the point being, if there's so, what would it mean? He established existence, or he made the ladder endure as it was on the seventh day. What happened on the seventh day? That was the day when God stopped the creation process, and now the world is as it is, right? So now we see the world. Now all the laws of science are put into play, and the world is now running the way it's meant to be run. The scripture would say that on every day of the preceding 6, events occurred that did not correspond to the established nature that exists at present, the whole of existence, right? Right today, we see a whole lot of rules that happen. We know the day starts at certain times and the sun sets at certain times and trees grow in certain ways and the weather happens in certain ways. Well, all of that, it took time for the world to develop to the point where all the rules and laws that we see around us were true, right? Because there was the cosmos weren't set up exactly the way they were until a certain point. Maybe the moon wasn't rotating around the earth and the earth wasn't rotating around the sun and the solar system. All those things weren't in play yet. But by that time, but little by little, over the first 6 days, each one of those things happened, so that by the seventh day, everything is exactly the way it's meant to be forever. So whereas on the seventh day, the state of things became lasting and established just as it is at present. I'm going to skip a couple sentences about conjugations of verbs, but I'm going to go down to the doing away with the notion in question, right? The reason why this is important, I just went down a few sentences. I'm like in the middle of page 162 now. By getting rid of that idea, God resting, which gives rise to vain imagining, right? When you say the term God rested, it's going to cause your brain, all kinds of weird people, to think weird things. Rambam saying vain imaginings, right? You'll start thinking about, oh, God got tired and he sat down, put his head down, decided it's time to take a nap, right? And people think that way, especially when we're children. We think, oh, God was working hard, now he rested, right? It should, but don't think that it's important for us to read these words this way, even if it doesn't follow completely the rules of grammar. This is the bottom line of what he's saying. I'm not going into exactly why. He's saying because there are exceptions to the rules of conjugation obtaining in the Hebrew language, for we know that today we have no complete understanding of the science of our language, and all languages rules merely conform to majority of cases. So even though vayonach bayom hashvi, the bottom line of what he's saying here, without going into all of the grammar, is that grammatically correct, it actually means and God rested. But the Rambam is saying this is an exception to the rule, and where it means God made the world rest, right? And so on. Thus the dictum, right? And she shall be set there, right? Vayunach, right? And similarly, and she suffered neither the birds of the air to be established on them. These are all other places where it uses a language of nacha, right? Of meaning the world became established. In my opinion, the verb has this meaning also in the phrase that I might be established in the day of trouble, right? This is in Chavakuk. So I'll tell you the phrase in Chavakuk. It says, "Asher anuach liyom tzara." It's talking about the day of the future when there's going to be a lot of upheaval and suffering. But the beginning of that verse talks about how I heard what was happening, and I was shaking in fear and so on. But however, asher anuach liyom tzara. But nonetheless, I'm still anuach. I'm still solid. I'm still waiting for that day of suffering, right? Because the person has in that particular context has confidence in God and and his ability to get through it. So as for the verb vayinofash, which is another word, it's a passive form deriving from the word nefesh. Now we have already made clear the equivocation of the term soul, and I've explained that what soul means, it doesn't always mean, right? It can also mean a person's purpose, a person's volition, a person's will or desire to do something. Accordingly, what does it mean that vayinofash? It means his purpose was perfected, all his will realized. That God's purpose, what he wanted to accomplish with creation, was accomplished. So, at the end of the story, just a quick, it's just to understand, so we get this concept, right? The Rambam gave us two understandings of what it means that God rested, right? And none of them mean that he actually rested, right? What it means is either the first explanation of the Rambam, which means that he stopped. In other words, there was no more creation happening, right? Creation was happening. Now there's no more, right? He stopped that act, right? In other words, all of those processes which were happening until now were over. Now the other one is vayonach, which was the Rabbeinu Sajigon's understanding, and that was that vayonach, that God made the world rest. In other words, he created the world and put the rules of nature into place for the first 6 days, and that was over. And the seventh day, now the world was established in its natural state. I wonder if we think a little bit about this when we celebrate, Shabbos. or, Shabbat every week, when we think that rather the day that God rested, so to speak, but this is the day as it should be. This is the day as nature was established, as it is supposed to be. I wonder if that would have any effect on the way we celebrate and feel on Shabbat, but something to think about. Maybe some of you might have thoughts about this. But either way, I'm going to open the floor before we go on to chapter 68. Any questions or comments? Wait 1 second.
Comment. Could you analogize it to a woman giving birth as maybe happening? It's completed and it just happens, and no more creation. It's there. What do you think about that?
I guess you could make such an analogy. It's
And
hard for me. I see the process of birth. I mean, we're going a little off topic, but but it's just part of the process of bringing a human being into existence. So like it's starting with the process, of conception all the way through all the all the 40 weeks of gestation, and then the birth, and then raising the child from infancy to childhood to adulthood. It's all one long process. Birth is just a transition. I had a patient call me today, asked me a question about baby formula, and it freaked me out because it was obvious from her question that, number one, if she's asking her OBGYN about baby formula, then she doesn't know the proper channels for such questions, right? Because I'm not a pediatrician. So I got really nervous, and she was asking me about what to buy. So I immediately got social services involved to make sure she had the support she needs, and because it doesn't end when the baby's born. We gotta. But yeah, because it's certainly not a time when everything is set the way it should be. It's all growing. So in that sense, I don't like the analogy, but it's nice to think about anyway. Any other comments about this? Does anyone think this changes the way they think about Shabbos at all? Now, the word Shabbos is rest. The Rambam just told us Shabbos means stop. It means now it is the way it should be, right? You've done all the work, right, to make it the way it is, and now this is the way it's supposed to be.
Well, one question, one of my rabbis said, don't think that you're supposed to sleep through Shabbos, that it's a day of not clear, but you're supposed to study, and it's an important part of the week. It's not just negative. Is that consistent with what we're hearing here?
Well, it's consistent with it. I don't like that because I like sleeping on Shabbos, but okay. That's the best part. All right. Okay, so if there's no other comments, we'll go on to the next chapter 68. Now, this next chapter is going to be very how should I say, philosophical. A lot of philosophical logic, medieval logic, and it's going to be a little rough. So excuse me, for a large part of it, I might not read through the text. I'm just going to summarize what the paragraphs say. It's still very interesting and very important, but obviously, but it's going to be a little rough just reading the text here in English, because we'll get lost after three sentences. But here goes. The first paragraph I'm going to read. You already know that the following dictum of the philosophers with reference to God, right? We've mentioned this already in passing. We didn't delve into it, but we're about to delve into it. And that is, which is generally admitted, that all philosophers agree. The dictum being that he is the intellect, as well as the intellectual cognizing subject and the intellectually cognized object. I'll explain, I promise. And that those three notions form in him, may he be exalted, one single notion in which there is no multiplicity. Now, what does that all mean? So Rambam was going to explain this more, but I'll explain it first. And that is that, right, there's the subject, right, the person that we're talking about, that's me or you or whatever. We'll call him Joe for now, right? There's the guy. The guy thinks of something, right? So there's his intellect, right, that's thinking of the thing. And then there's the thing that he's thinking about, right? Whatever it is. Now, with God, all three of those things are one and the same. Okay. Now, what is that? It might sound like what is he saying? So let's give the Rambam a chance. But that's the meaning of that sentence. So there's the subject, meaning the guy who's doing the thinking. There's the intellect, which is itself, which is the thing that's doing the thinking, right? The brain with which he's thinking, right? And then there's the thing that he's thinking about. Those are the three things. So we have mentioned this likewise in our great compilation. In other words, we discussed this in Hilchos Yisodei Torah and the Mishnah Torah. This was discussed. As we have made clear there, this is one of the foundations of our law. I mean, the fact that he is one only and no other thing can be added to him. I mean to say that there is no eternal thing other than he, right? So because God is one and all is one, so in God, all those three things are one and the same. This is for this reason is said by the Lord the living and not by the life of the Lord. Now, what this is referring to in the Hebrew is whether it says we always say Chai Hashem and not Chei Hashem with the Tzeirei. This doesn't come out very well in the English translation. So, for example, where it says Rab Kapach in the Hebrew version, in his version, he explains, he compares it to where it says Chei Paro, right? The life of Paro. By the life of Paro, we say Chei with the Tzeirei. But with God, we never say, we say Chai Hashem. Now, what does that mean? Because when we say Chei Paro, we're talking about the life of Paro, right? And we say Chai Hashem means God lives, right? So God lives is a true statement, as long as we understand that living by God is not the same thing as living for a corporeal being like us, right? But to say the life of God, that's saying that there is something which is of God. That's attributing something to God, okay? Which is wrong, as for his life is not something other than his essence, Rambam says, as we have made clear when speaking of the negation of attributes a couple of weeks ago, when Rambam rammed it into our heads that we can't give God attributes, right? However, there is no doubt that anyone who has not studied the books that have been composed, so this is good for us because we've been studying philosophy, right? But for people that haven't studied philosophy, they don't necessarily get this, right? Anyone who has not studied the books that have composed concerning the intellect has not grasped the essence of the intellect, and it has not acquired knowledge of its quiddity, and has no understanding of it other than one that resembles his understanding of the notions of blackness and whiteness. So he's thinking, okay, I'm describing something by using a descriptor, such as its color. Is it black or is it white? So he'll have difficulty understanding this notion. In fact, when I say that God is the cognition as well as the subject and the object, it would be as if we said that whiteness, which has become white, and that which whitens are one and the same thing. Now, how many ignoramuses there are who hasten to refute us by means of this and similar examples, and how many pretending to knowledge there are who have great difficulties with regard to this, and who hold that minds cannot attain the knowledge that it is correct that this matter should necessarily be true. Yet, however, it's a matter of demonstration is quite clear, as the philosophers have explained. Now, here Rambam says, I shall make clear to you that which they have demonstrated. Okay, now, so now he's going to make it clear to us. So I am going to explain this next chapter outside without reading the text to try to make it sound in a language that we can understand. And feel free to read the text, and you'll understand what I mean. So, and one thing that I'm going to do, which might be somewhat controversial, a scholar might argue with me and say that this is inappropriate, but I'm going to use modern terms to describe some of these things, because we now know that there's brains, right? We as human beings have a brain. The brain does thinking. And in the brain, there's neurons that are connected with each other and form neural networks and electric impulses, so that when we think of something, one can say that that thing that we're thinking of, that image in our mind, is actually a pile of thousands, maybe millions of electrical impulses intertwined in such a way that form in our brain that image, right? So we actually have a language that Rambam didn't have available to him to explain the phenomenon that he's philosophically going to derive. So when I use the terms brains and neurons, don't think that I think that the Rambam was referring to brains and neurons. However, it makes it easier for us to understand what the Rambam is saying now that we have those terms and we have those concepts that he would not have necessarily known, or would obviously did not know. So now think like this. If there's a concept, right? Let's say you needed to understand the concept of a table, right? Right. The table consists of all kinds of things. It's what it's made of, its color, its size, its strength, it's all bunch of things, right? So there's you, there's me or you, right? That's the person, Joe, let's say. So Joe wants to right now he's walking down the street and he hasn't thought about this table yet at all. He's just a guy. He's walking down the street doing his thing, right? And and so he's the subject, right? Now, when we say he, we don't mean necessarily the human body, right? We mean whatever the I is, whatever the human being is, the person, his soul, the driving force that makes Joe Joe, right? Then there's the means that Joe uses to think things, right? And then there's a concept of a table, but that concept of a table isn't yet in his brain. So there's potential, right? So there's a potential idea that Joe doesn't know yet. It's not in his brain yet. So at this point, there's three separate things. Joe hasn't yet told his brain, right, to think of a table, right? So the table hasn't yet formed all those neuronal networks and connections that form images of a table in someone's brain. However, the moment Joe looks at the table and learns about the table, right? Because why did he do that? Because he decided, oh, there's a table. I'm going to look at the table and decide whether this table is big enough to put my computer on, right? And so then he's going to think about the table. Now, all of a sudden, so when it's potential knowledge, right, there's three separate things. There's Joe, there's Joe's brain, right, which is capable of forming images of tables, but it hasn't done so yet. And then there's the image of a table, which hasn't yet been formed. As soon as Joe sees the table and then thinks about it and forms an image in his head, now all three of those things are one, right? All of a sudden, the Joe that wants to think of a table, right? The brain that thinks of the table and the image of the table in the mind are one thing. So that mind, that brain that has thought of the table has now apprehended it, right? And it's there. The neuronal networks which make up the brain and those networks that make up the pattern, which is a table, right? And the Joe who decided, however this works, we don't know, but Joe deliberately decides to think of a table, they're all one thing. So by a human being, so the bottom line of this entire paragraph, which ends in the top of page 165, is to tell you, right, that a human being or any corporeal being, prior to thinking of something, there's three separate things. There's a subject, an object, and a there's a subject, there's the person, there's the intellect, and then there's the object, right? There's a subject, there's the thing that the subject uses, which is the intellect, and there's an object, which the subject uses the intellect upon the object. But once he thinks of it, now they're all one. Okay. However, so now if we take this and if we go to on page 165 now, the first paragraph in 165, it starts with the words if. Now that we understand that, I'm going to start reading from the text a little, but I might skip around a little bit. If, however, potential cognition is assumed, right? In other words, if you assume that it's possible to not know something yet, but then you could know something later, that is, the intellect in potentia and the potentially constant object are necessarily two things. So then it has to be that once you say that it's possible for someone to not know something yet, then these items have to be separate, right? If you said, for example, that the hilic intellect subsisting in Zaid is an Arabic term for Joe or Ploni, right? Or Ruvain in the Gemara, Ruvain and Shimon, this is a generic name, is a potential intellect. And similarly, this piece of wood, that's the thing that you're cognizing, that's the object that you're thinking about, is in potentia an intellectually cognized object. Intuitively, these are two separate things. When thereupon the intellect becomes actual and the form of the piece of wood is realized as intellectually cognized, when you think of the wood, now the cognized form is identical with the intellect. that very intellect, which is an intellect in actu, which is now an intellect that's actually thinking, being the one by means of which the form was abstracted and intellectually cognized. Okay, the Rambam is really, I should have probably skipped this because he's really putting the same point out there. But moreover, everything that is potentia must undoubtedly have a substratum supporting this potentiality. Because there are three separate things, there has to be a mamashus. I don't know if that's the yeshivish word for it. There has to be a substance that makes it up, right? Because they're separate, there's something, there's wood that makes a table, right? There's neurons that make a brain, right? So because they're separate things. And for an example in question, this would be as if you said there's a man, there's his intellect, and then there's the form of the piece of wood, being three separate notions. But once he realizes it, right, they all become one. Fine. So that's the point. Those two paragraphs make those points. Now, this is the second paragraph on 165. When it is demonstrated that God, now remember, here's the thing. Before I read this paragraph, God does not, there is no such thing as potential in God. There can't be a change. It can't be that God doesn't know something yet and then he comes to know something, right? God always, I mean, I'm describing the word always as an inappropriate term because that assumes time for God, but I don't have any better term. So I have to use that word because there is no better human term. But God, there is no potential. Whatever it is that God knows, he always knows. So for God, it's always one. So not only is God always one, but everything that God knows is always one, right? Because everything that God knows is everything. So it's all one, right? So remember, there is no difference. Like we have a difference between what we think and then what's outside of what we think. For God, there is no such difference. So everything is all one. It's all God's brain, so to speak, right? And the brain is the same as God, and God is the same as the brain, and the brain is the same as everything that the brain knows, which is everything in existence. So, and I read it, may he be held present, is an intellect and active, and there's absolutely no potentiality in him, as is clear and shall be demonstrated. So that he is not by way of sometimes apprehending and sometimes not apprehending. It's not that God sometimes knows something and sometimes doesn't, but it is always an intellect and active. It follows necessarily that he and the thing apprehended are one thing, which is his essence. And what is that one thing? That one thing is the essence of God. Moreover, the act of apprehension, owing to which he is said to be an intellectually cognizing subject, is in itself the intellect, which is said. In other words, the actor and the brain with which the actor thinks is all the same, or the intellect with which he thinks, right? It's obviously not a brain. Accordingly, he is always the intellect as well as the subject and the cognized object. It is accordingly also clear that the numerical unity of the intellect and the subject and the object does not hold good with reference to the creator only, but also with reference to every intellect. This fact that I said, that when an intellect knows something, it unifies those three, is true about everything. It's true about us too, like we just demonstrated. Thus, in us too, the intellectually cognized subject, the intellect itself, and the object are one and the same thing whenever we have an intellect and active, whenever we're actually thinking of something. We, however, but you and I, we think of something and then we forget it. We think of something and then somebody asks us a question and contradicts what we thought, and then we knock the thought out of our brains, right? So we potentially actually from time to time. Sometimes I'm thinking about a table. Sometimes I'm thinking about this class that I'm giving, and sometimes I'm thinking about doing a delivery, and sometimes I'm thinking about eating lunch, right? Whatever it is. So we're constantly going from thing to thing. So we separate those things from each other on a constant basis. So, and the separate intellect, I mean, the active sometimes gets an impediment that hinders this act, even if that does not proceed from the intellect's essence. It could be extraneous to it. In other words, you could veer me away to a different topic, right? You could grab me by the hand and ask me to go over there and look at something else, right? Now, we do not intend at present to explain this. Our intention being to affirm that which pertains solely to him may be exalted, and which is specific to him is his being constantly in intellect and actu, and that there is no impediment either proceeding from his essence or from another that might hinder his apprehending. So God never has anything like that will take his attention, so to speak, away from subject A to subject B. Accordingly, it follows necessarily because of this that he is always and constantly an intellectually cognizing subject, an intellect, and an intellectually cognized object. Thus, his essence is all three again, as is also necessarily the case with regard to every intellect inactive. We have repeated this notion several times in this chapter. Now the Rambam is telling us, why have I been so repetitive, right? I said it so many times because the minds of men are very much strangers to this way of representing the thing to oneself. This is a concept that he has to knock into our brains, right? And as we go through the Sefer, remember, all of us have learned many concepts as we work through the Sefer, and then we come later to another chapter, and all of a sudden those concepts that we took into our minds from previous chapters get put into play, right? That's how the Rambam is building this book, right? And this is another building block he wants us to put in our brain so that we can understand what we're reading as we go through this process of studying this book. I do not consider that you might confuse intellectual representation with imagination and with the reception of an image of a sense object by the imaginative faculty. All right. I do not want, right, or consider that you might think, right, that when you represent something, so there's a difference here. Intellectual representation means when you have a true representation of an object, when you define a table by its actual things, as opposed to imagination, which is somewhat of a derogatory term, right? Which means, you know, just your mind wandering and making things up, right? I do not consider that you're going to make that confusion, as this treatise has been composed only for the benefit of those who have philosophized and have acquired knowledge of what has become clear with reference to the soul and all its faculties, right? So you understand, when he says philosophize here, it means you understand the process of logic and you understand how to achieve truth. So you're not going to get confused that. So therefore, I'm giving you this building block with which to understand how God is always, right? Not so I've emphasized to you, the Rambam says a whole lot of principles going back in chapters, right? He's emphasized that God doesn't have any corporeal explanations. God doesn't have any attributes, right? God doesn't exist in a realm of time, right? And now I just explained to you that God does not, there is no difference between what God knows, who God is, and the thing it is that God knows with. They're all one and the same. So that's a concept which he puts down. And as I'm going to stop here for today. So remember, so we did two things. We learned what Shabbos means, right? What it means when God said the world should be, right? What it means that God rested, right? And then we went and Rambam laid a very important philosophical building block to understanding Maimonidean theology, which was this all three issues: the object, subject, and the intellect itself, all being the same, one and the same. The next few chapters, I mean, there's going to be a lot of philosophy coming up in the next few weeks, so you'll just have to brace yourselves for it. And every once in a while, he'll throw in another word and another term, just like he's been now, to explain another difficult concept in the Torah. So I'm going to stop here for tonight, but the floor is open for anyone who has something they would like to contribute.
I just wanted to say that it's a little bit insulting of the Rambam that after 60 some chapters, he suddenly says to you, but you might be stupid and you might not understand any of what I said.
Right. Well, yeah, he's a lot of things he said could be insulting. He didn't mince words when it came to dumb people. And I say dumb people, that's a soft word. Rambam was much stronger than that, as we've seen. The Pine's English softens the blow sometimes, or Kapach's Hebrew is much stronger. I wonder what it would be like if we read in the original Arabic. It's probably even stronger than that.
Wow.
Anyway, yes, go ahead.
A question?
Sure, please.
If you go back to the very beginning of chapter 68, it's let's see, it's a very first or second sentence.
Okay.
Being that he is the intellect as well as the intellectually cognizing subject and the intellectually cognized object. I'm not quite sure. I mean, when we think of something, we don't think that we don't think that in our minds, the object, I mean, unless we're thinking a thought about our mind, like imagination or something like
Right.
that, we don't think about an object in the external world
Mhm.
as being and the intellectually cognized object. I'm not quite sure. Can you repeat?
Yeah.
what-
So one of the things this might be what you're driving at, and tell me if this. So I was bothered also because I was trying to understand what does he mean when he says that we're all those three are the same. Like I'm right now thinking about this computer that's in front of me, right? Now
Mhm.
that computer is not the same thing that's in my brain. The computer is outside my brain. It's sitting on my desk, right? So
Right.
it's a separate thing, right? So I think the way I think the Rambam means, I think he means as follows, right? If assume for a moment that I understood this computer and every single thing about it, right? Like I knew everything, how every button attaches to every wire, attaches to every, and exactly how the microprocessor and all the chips work and how it all works together, right?
Mhm.
And then I had a complete 100% representation of this computer in my brain, right? Now, Rambam doesn't mean to say that the actual computer is in my brain, right? Because it's not, right? It's still sitting in front of me. But the concept of the computer, everything about the computer is in my brain, right?
Mhm.
So when I understand something, so I'm saying if a human being understands something about the world, right, then that thought, because it's true. Remember, he said it's only true about true things, right? Because it's true and it's real, then then all that thought in my mind is identical, right, to that thing that's standing in front of me. Now, for God, it's different, right? Because for God, God's thought is real, right? In other words, if God thinks a world, then that world is here. We're living in it, right? So for God, it actually is the same, right? I mean, please don't misquote me on this, but if I was God sitting in this chair, right, thinking about this computer, then that's what makes the whole computer be, right? So for God, the computer is the thing that's in his brain, so to speak, right? I know what I just said. Please, no one take that out of context and quote. But I think so the concept of the computer, though, if I know everything there is possibly to know about the computer and it's in my mind, then I still have an image. I have a computer in my brain. I have a brain that's thinking the computer, and there's an I whose brain is thinking about a computer, and they're all the one same thing. Does that answer your question?
I'll have to think about it.
Okay. All right. Yeah,
Thank
go
you.
ahead, Jeff.
I have a confusion. How
Yes.
we have language and we think when we talk,
Right.
we have a noun, a verb, an object. We structure our thought in certain departments.
Right.
How can we possibly think that God has a language? I mean, how do we even get into this where we're trying to break down God in human terms? Because she doesn't have a, how can we assume that God has any thought process that in any way resembles our own?
I'll have to say that you're right. We can't, and it doesn't resemble our own for many reasons. But one of them is because for us these three things are separate, and for God these three things are all one and the same. That's one, because they're God's essence, right, which is something that we can't comprehend, right, is one, and the subject, object, and the essence are all the same, right? But there's a lot of reasons why God is something that we can't comprehend. But
So
this is
why do we even try to put it in these boxes?
well, what you're really asking is
I mean, why do we even think God
I
thinks?
hear what you're saying.
Even the idea of an intellect is just a bunch of
yeah,
letters. How can you
yeah,
apply an
right.
intellect to God?
Yeah, what you're really asking is, to some extent, the Rambam seems to be contradicting what he said before when he talked about the negative attributes, that we can't describe God at all, right? We
Right.
can only describe God by what he's not. right? He made that very strong case. And here he's describing something about God, right? Because he's saying that God is all these three things. That's a very good question. I don't know a good answer other than to say that probably what Rambam would say is, no, I mean to tell you that we can't understand this. But you know, that we can't comprehend what that means to be all those three at the same time. But you're still asking a very good question. And I didn't think of that. And I don't know, maybe as he uses this building block in the future, we might understand a little better. But that's a really good question. He's not going to use it anytime in the next few weeks. I don't remember, but he will. It's going to come up, you know, and we'll try to, hopefully we'll remember this question then. Any other comments for the week? All right. I think next week we should go, and then after that is Pesach, right? So next week should be okay, and then after that we'll be off for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah. So thank you very much for joining, and looking forward to continuing. And yeah, it's going to be interesting the next few weeks. There's a lot of philosophy the next few weeks, so just be braced for it. All right.
Thank you.
Anyway, have a wonderful day. Yes, be well.
Thank you.